Hello, I'm Roger Cohen, and we're going to do a Bible lesson here tonight for you, and going to try to go into the subject of the human free will principle, and we've got it right up here, the human free will principle illuminated, and that's what we want to try to do, is to shed some light. We want to put some light on this subject because there's a lot of light that needs to be put on it. I will acknowledge that this is not a lesson for young Christians. It's not a lesson for non-Christians necessarily. This is more or less something for advanced Christians. But anybody that wants to watch it can watch it. I'd advise you to pray for the Lord to help you. And we want to say that if you're not saved, you need to be saved. And if you're not saved, that's the greatest need that you have, is to be saved. And so if you're not saved, I advise you to begin to pray and ask the Lord to help you and to guide you into the way of truth, the way of salvation in Jesus Christ through His blood. But anyway, this lesson right here tonight is on the subject of the human free will principle. And it's a subject that lots of people, they don't have any idea whatsoever what's going on with that subject. And we want to throw some light on this subject. We want to try to do that. And so we've got seven statements here that we want to touch on, and one by one at a time. And we want to start out with this first statement concerning Adam and Eve and their original sin, the original transgression, where that they was put in the Garden of Eden, and they was commanded that there was one tree in this garden that they should not eat the fruit off of this tree, which was called the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And the Lord told them not to eat of that fruit. He said, you can eat of all these other trees, and we don't know how many there was, probably a lot of fruit there that they could eat, but this one tree they was not supposed to eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. But when we look at the human free will principle, that we say right here, Adam and Eve could have rebuked the tempter. According to the human free will principle, they could have rebuked the tempter. They could have told him, the serpent, they could have told him to move on. God's told us not to do this, we're not going to do it. You know, you get on out of here. And I believe if they had done that, which they was not going to do that, but if they had done that, then I believe the Lord would have banished him from the garden. I don't believe they would have had to continue to put up with the serpent tempting them time after time after time. I believe they could have rebuked him one time and told him, we're not going to do this. God said don't do it, and we're not going to do it. So let that settle the matter. Then I believe that God would have honored that. If they had done that, I believe the Lord would have honored that, and I believe He would have banished him from the garden, and he would not have been allowed to aggravate them anymore concerning that matter. But they didn't do that. They fell to the temptation. They fell into sin. And but according to the human free will principle, they could have done that. They could have rebuked him. surely they had the right to do that. They had the right to do that, but they didn't necessarily have the power to do that. Now, what we want to think about right here tonight is the difference between free will power and free will rights. They had every right to rebuke the tempter. They had every right to do that, but obviously they didn't have the power to do that. They was dealing with a creature that was far more powerful than they was intellectually. He had the power to overpower them and to cause them, especially cause the woman, to believe that they could do this and everything would still be okay. And the man, he had a weak heart that kept him from controlling his wife, because he was there with her. According to the Bible, he was right there with her, and he should have stopped her and said, "No, we can't do this." But he didn't do that, and he allowed her not only to eat the fruit, but then he also allowed her to give him the fruit, and he also ate of the fruit of the tree of life. And so they both committed sin. And we know if you study the Bible in depth and you acknowledge what you read, and you acknowledge the import of what you read, then you're going to have to know that the fall of creation was foreordained. God foreordained that creation would fall. It had to be in order for him to have the occasion to manifest his love and a plan of redemption. It was foreordained that creation would fall, and that the whole creation would pass up under the law of sin and death, and that death would pass upon all men, and not only all men, but all creatures, all living creation. Even the plants die, and the trees die, and the plants die, and the grass dies. Everything that has life, it dies. Because of the law of sin and death was passed upon the whole creation because of man's sin. And so we understand that this was foreordained, and we know that because that the lamb, the sacrifice, was slain from before the beginning of the world. So that don't leave any doubt about it. You can argue with it, you can disagree with it, but it's that way anyway. The fall of creation was foreordained. It had to be in order for God to have already foreordained a plan of redemption. In order to have redemption, there had to be a fall. And so he foreordained the plan of redemption before the foundation of the world. So the fall had to also be foreordained. And in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15, we realize that not only was the fall of creation foreordained, but the foreordination of the fall was revealed to Adam and Eve right there on the spot. Whenever the Lord come into the garden and he called them into account of what they had done, then he revealed to them that the fall was foreordained right there on the spot. Now, he didn't come out and just say it that way, but he pronounced the curse upon the serpent. And in the 15th verse of Genesis chapter 3, he told the serpent how that his seed would bruise the heel of the woman's seed, and her seed would bruise his head. And we know that this is a prophecy concerning what Jesus Christ was going to do to the serpent. You might say it's retribution for what the serpent done in causing creation to fall. In causing Adam and Eve to fall, there was going to be a retribution from the hand of God. And that was that the seed of the woman would bruise his head. and creation would be redeemed. All of creation was redeemed. Every bit of it was redeemed, and even though individual people have the rights to refuse, they have the right to opt out of the plan of redemption. They have the right to do that, but they were still redeemed. It was all redeemed in Jesus Christ. All of creation was redeemed. It was bought back, and so we're talking about the earthly creation. We're talking about the creation, the earthly creation. We're not talking about the heavenly creation right there, because that was not redeemed. The devil and his angels were not redeemed in the sacrifice of Christ. Might seem good if they had been, but they wouldn't. But anyway, the foreordination of the fall was revealed to Adam and Eve in the statement that God made there to the serpent. He was talking to the serpent when he said what he did. But no doubt Adam and Eve didn't understand. I feel like they lived long lives. They lived hundreds of years on the earth after this, and I feel like it took time for them to realize, you know, all of the significance and the deeper significance of Genesis 3 and 15. But over the process of time, I feel sure that Adam in particular began to realize that this thing was foreordained, and which of course would have kept him from being, or would have kept them from being totally crushed by what they had done. They still would have been sad. They still would have realized what they had done, and would have been very sad about it, but they would not have been crushed on the order that they would have been if they didn't have some understanding of the fact that it was in the divine purpose, that their fall was in the divine purpose. We could go on and on about that if we could keep our thoughts together, but we can't get through this lesson without moving on, so we're going to go to the second. We want to look at Job, and we want to think about Job, and we want to think a little bit about Job and what happened to Job, and how that Job was a perfect man, and there was none like him in all the earth, is what the Lord said, and so God pointed him out to Satan and allowed Satan to take him and to try him and destroy everything that he had, and take everything away from him that he had, and even take his health away from him and afflict his body. God allowed the devil to do that, give him permission to do that. And as a result of all of this, Job, he held his tongue to start off with, and eventually 3 of his friends come to see him and to try to help him, but they sat down on the ground with him for 7 days, the Bible says, and they couldn't even say anything, because they seen such a great trial that he was in, and such great affliction. And when the 7 days was over, then the Bible tells us that Job opened his mouth. And the Bible says that Job cursed his day. And I have said it this way before, that if Job had exercised his rights of free will, if Job had exercised the rights of free will that he had, instead of cursing his day, he could have blessed his day. And if he had blessed his day, then the rest of the book of Job would be an entirely different story, and we don't know exactly how it would have been. But it would have been completely different if Job had blessed his day instead of cursing his day, and he had the right to do that. He had every right to do that. He probably had the duty to do that. But he couldn't do that because his mind was not disposed that way. And he done what his mind disposed him to do, and what he was disposed to do by his circumstances. That's what he done. And he really done the only thing that he could do. He had the rights to do otherwise. He had the rights to have blessed his day up rather than cursed his day, but he couldn't do that because his mind, no doubt that thought never even come to his mind, that he needed to bless his day rather than curse his day. But what came to his mind was to curse his day, and that's what he done. If he could have seen the end of his trial, then he might truly have blessed his day instead of cursing his day, but he couldn't see the end of his trial. All of that was hid from him, and he couldn't see it. And so to him it looked like it was all over and that he was going to suffer this way until he died, and then he would die and his life would be over. So to him it looked like there was no purpose for him ever having to have been born to begin with, and that being the case, he just went ahead and cursed his day. Now the Lord's going to talk to him about that on over at the end of the book. He may not have said it that way, but the Lord still talked to him about that. But anyway, Job could have blessed his day by the human, according to the human free will principle. Job could have blessed his day rather than cursed his day. He had the right to do that. Probably had the duty to do that, but he lost sight of all of that, and he done the only thing that his mind would dispose him to do. So there again, he followed the pattern that was foreordained of God, because the plan of God was for it to go exactly the way it went, and then for him to be elevated again at the end of his trial. The sovereign will of God is it's like a printer. It prints out every day. Nobody knows unless you understand it by the prophecy of the Bible. You can't know what the sovereign will of God is. Prophecy is the revealed sovereign will of God, revealed beforehand. And so, but nevertheless, it prints out every day, just like coming out of a printer. The sovereign will of God does, and then we know what it is. We know that when we see it happen. But anyway, that's statement 2 there. We'll move on to statement 3. According to the human free will principle, the 12 apostles of Jesus Christ could have stood with him there in his temptation. They could have stood with him instead of forsaking him. The Bible tells us that they all forsook him and fled. They took off, they run, they got out of there, which was what he had warned them that they would do if they didn't pray. And so they didn't pray. They went to sleep on the job, and they never watched and prayed the way the Lord told them that they needed to do. And he told them, he warned them if they didn't do that, they would enter into temptation, and they did, and they failed. Just like Adam and Eve failed in the garden, and just like Job failed in cursing his day, likewise the 12 apostles failed. They failed to stand with their master, to stand with the Lord in his temptation. Well, there again we know God didn't intend for them to stand with him in his temptation. It was intended for him to go through that alone, without anybody. Even the Father himself turned away and left him completely alone, so that he had nobody at all. That was the way it had to be. It was foreordained to be that way. If the 12 apostles, or even any one of the 12 apostles, had stood with him and went to death with him, then that would not have been according to the purpose of God, not according to the divine purpose. So they wasn't able to do that, but they was allowed to fail and come short there, but according to the human free will principle, they could have, every one of them could have stood with the Lord, even Judas. But there again, Judas had a part to play, and he played that part. And but he didn't play it alone. All of the other 11 forsook him and fled. Maybe they didn't betray him, but they did forsake him. And so they could have stood with him according to the principle of human free will. They had the right. They had the right to do it. No doubt they had the duty to do it. But they failed to do it. It was not in the foreordained plan of God. It was not in the sovereign will of God. Divine purpose and the sovereign will of God are the same thing. Sovereign will of God is a theological term that we use. The Bible speaks of the eternal purpose. Same thing. So there again, man failed because it was in the divine purpose for man to fail, in order that God might ultimately be responsible for the success of the plan of salvation in its execution, initiation. Statement number 4, Paul could have disobeyed the heavenly vision. When Paul was on the way from Jerusalem to Damascus to bind the saints of God that were at Damascus, bind them and throw them in prison, whatever. He was on his way there to do that, and we know the story. If you read the Bible, you know the story that great light shined from heaven, shined down around about him, and he fell to the earth. He was overpowered by this great light, and he heard the voice of the Lord speaking to him from heaven. And it pierced right into his heart, because the Lord spoke right to what he was doing. And it was no doubt, it was like the Bible says, the word is quick and powerful, piercing even, to divide asunder joints and marrow and soul and spirit, and so it pierced his heart. But we have said it before, and we'll say it again right here, right now, that according to the human free will principle, Saul could have got up off of the ground and he could have shook his fist at the sky and said, I will not obey this vision. According to the human free will principle, he could have done that. In reality, according to what we call right here, what we're going to call the factored orientation principle, or something to that effect. We've not got a perfect term worked out on that, and may not ever have a perfect term worked out on that, but his factors disposed his mind, just as Job was disposed to curse his day. Paul was disposed in his mind not to resist the heavenly vision, but rather to obey the heavenly vision. That's the way his mind was disposed, by his factors. His circumstances disposed him to obedience, not just to obedience right there at that particular time, but to obedience for the rest of his life on this earth. He was disposed to obedience by the light and the voice from heaven. He was disposed to obedience, and that was to a permanent walk of obedience. And he really couldn't do anything else, because his mind was disposed to obey God from that time on. And he was a chosen vessel, as the Lord said, and he had a work to do, and God told Ananias what that work would be, to bear his name before kings and Gentiles and the people, and so Saul was going to do that. And God had a way to dispose him to do that. And that's what the Lord done. God sees the end from the beginning, and he knows what he's doing from the beginning in every situation. Paul told Agrippa, he said, wherefore I was not disobedient unto the heavenly vision. And some take that as an implication that he could have been disobedient to the heavenly vision, because he told Agrippa, I was not disobedient. Well, truly, there is a certain sense of implicit there that he could have disobeyed. But the fact of the matter is no more than what we've already said. He was disposed to obedience by the heavenly vision. And in that sense, he really could not his will was made subject to God's will from that time on. So anyway, that's point number 4, statement number 4. Statement number 5, human free will power is an illusion or an imagination. Now, we've already said that we have the rights. We've already said that we acknowledge that we have free will rights and even the duty to obey God. But when we say that human free will power is an illusion, we're talking about human free will power, not human free will rights. Actually, we have no power to choose the good or to choose righteousness except God instills it in us by the factors, as He did with the Apostle Paul and others that the Scripture would tell us about that done the right thing. It's because that God instilled in them the power to do what they've done. And but human free will power is an illusion, and that is exactly what it is. And we stand firm on that statement, even though that's going to be so disturbing to lots of people. That is going to be very disturbing to a lot of people if they hear what I say, if they watch this video and hear what I'm saying about that. Nevertheless, I'm sticking to my guns, or to my bamboo rod here, that human free will power is an illusion. It's the most natural imagination that we form in our minds. Because, you know, I can raise this rod and I can bring it back down. I can raise and bring it down as many times as I want to. I could, if I wanted to throw it, I could throw it and hit the wall. Whatever I want to do with it, I can do with it. And so I very naturally form an illusion in my mind that I've got human free will power. But what we got to realize there is whatever we do, anything that we do it by an impulse. And we do not control our impulses. We may think that we do. There again, there's that natural imagination or illusion. But really we don't. We don't control our impulses. We just imagine that we do. And I can even have a counter impulse where I can say, well, I'm going to raise this rod to show that I've got free will power. And then I say, no, I'm not going to do that because I'm going to prove that I've got human free will power by not obeying that impulse. But if I do that, I'm obeying a counter impulse. I'm still obeying an impulse. Whatever we do, we obey an impulse. And we don't really control our impulses. They do spring from our heart, but we don't control the state of our heart like we imagine that we do. God gives us a heart to obey Him. If we have obedience to Him in our heart, He give it to us. And we didn't put that in there. We may fool ourselves into believing that we did. That's the easiest form of self-deception that there is that we would fool ourselves into believing that. Paul said that we should cast down imaginations. And he didn't go so far as to say that this is what he had in his mind when he said that, but still, I say, myself in my theology, I say that the most needful imagination that needs to be cast down is the imagination of human free will power. If we can cast that down the way that we really need to, then I think we can say that we're as spiritual as it's possible to be in this life. So I know that there might be lots of controversy we could keep on dealing with there, but we will be doing other videos where we'll be talking more about these things. Let's move on down to point number 6, statement number 6. The spiritual vision of a growing Christian should be like a thermometer. What are we talking about there when we say that?